He thought he owned the night, until the quietest voice in his house told him to disappear into it. Kang Ji-hyun stepped out of his black sedan earlier than anyone expected, the gravel driveway of his Seoul estate crunching under polished Italian leather shoes that had never known hesitation. The night air cool against his skin, carrying a stillness that didn't belong, a silence too complete, too careful, like the world itself was holding its breath. His schedule was never wrong, his arrivals never unpredictable. And yet tonight something had shifted, a meeting canceled without explanation. A call that ended too quickly. A feeling he couldn't name settling somewhere beneath his ribs as the towering gates closed behind him with a soft mechanical hum that echoed louder than it should have. And as he walked toward the front entrance, the lights inside the mansion seemed dimmer than usual, shadows stretching longer across marble floors visible through the glass. His reflection staring back at him like a stranger who sensed what he refused to admit. He reached for the handle, pushing. The door opened without hesitation, because hesitation was not a language he spoke, stepping into a house that should have responded to his presence with quiet efficiency. Distant footsteps, the subtle acknowledgement of staff trained to move around him like ghosts. But instead there was nothing, no movement, no sound, only the faint hum of electricity and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the estate, each second louder than the last. And that was when he noticed it. The smallest shift in the air, a presence not where it should be, not visible, not obvious, but wrong in a way that tightened something inside him. He took another step forward, posture straight, eyes scanning without turning his head, calculating without appearing to, when suddenly a hand, steady, controlled, unexpected, touched his sleeve from the darkness just beyond the entryway, and before instinct could fully take over, before authority could reassert itself, a voice barely above a breath reached him. Soft but unshakably certain. "Sir, stay quiet." The words didn't echo, didn't demand, didn't plead. They settled into the space between them like a truth that had already decided itself. And Kang Ji-hyun, a man who had never taken orders from anyone, froze mid-step, his gaze shifting just enough to find her, Amara Johnson, the maid no one noticed, standing half in shadow, her eyes not fearful, not uncertain, but focused with a clarity that didn't belong to someone in her position, her posture angled slightly as if shielding him from something he couldn't yet see. And in that suspended moment, something unfamiliar happened. He didn't speak, didn't question, didn't assert control, because beneath the quiet of her voice was something else, something he recognized in the rarest of circumstances, a certainty born not from authority, but from awareness. And, as the silence stretched between them, thicker now, heavier, he realized the house was not empty. It was listening, every wall, every corridor holding onto a presence that did not belong. And for the first time in years, Kang Ji-hyun understood that the night he thought he controlled had already moved one step ahead of him. And the only reason he was still standing there, untouched, unaware of what waited beyond the next room, was because the one person he had never truly seen had chosen him. That precise moment, to step out of invisibility and become something else entirely. And he did not yet know why. Amara did not remove her hand immediately, as if even that small movement could fracture something fragile in the air, her fingers resting lightly against the sleeve of Kang Ji-hyun's tailored coat, steady but not forceful, guiding rather than commanding, and for a man accustomed to controlling every inch of space around him, the restraint in her touch spoke louder than any demand ever could. His eyes adjusted further to the dimness, catching details that had been deliberately arranged to look ordinary, the subtle misalignment of a chair leg against the marble floor, the faint reflection of something metallic in the far hallway mirror that should not have been there, and somewhere above them, almost imperceptible, a shift in weight that did not belong to the quiet rhythm of a well-run household. "Explain," he said at last, his voice low, controlled, but softer than it had any right to be in a moment like this. And Amara shook her head almost instantly, not out of defiance, but urgency, her gaze flicking upward for less than a second before returning to him, that single glance carrying more information than words could safely hold. Not here, she whispered, her voice barely shaping the air, and without waiting for permission, she stepped slightly closer, angling her body between him and the open space of the foyer, not shielding him in a way that would insult his pride, but redirecting his presence, guiding him 2 steps back toward the shadowed edge of the wall where the light from the chandelier did not fully reach. It was a calculated position, one that reduced visibility from above without drawing attention from below, and Jae-hyun noticed it. Of course he did, because noticing was how he survived. But what unsettled him was not the movement itself, it was how natural it seemed to her, how practiced, as if she had rehearsed this exact moment long before it ever happened. The silence stretched again, heavier now, layered with awareness, and then he heard it clearly, the faintest sound of fabric shifting against wood from the upper level, followed by stillness, so complete it confirmed what it tried to hide. Someone was there, someone who believed they had the advantage of surprise, someone who did not expect resistance from within these walls. And for the first time since entering his own home, Kang Ji-hyun did not move forward, he did not call out, he did not signal for the security team that should have already been visible, because something deeper, something instinctive, told him that the system he trusted had already been compromised. His gaze returned to Amara, studying her now not as background, not as staff, but as a variable he had never accounted for. Her breathing even, her posture grounded, her eyes tracking invisible lines across the room as if mapping movements that had not yet occurred. And when she finally spoke again, it was not a suggestion, it was a decision already made. They are waiting for you to walk further in, she said, the words precise, controlled, stripped of anything unnecessary. And though she did not specify who they were, she did not need to, because the implications settled into the space between them with undeniable clarity. Jae-hyun's jaw tightened slightly, not in fear, but in recognition of a situation that required something unfamiliar, restraint, and for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression. Not weakness, not doubt, but calculation recalibrating around a new center, one that included her. How long have you known? He asked quietly, and Amara hesitated, not because she lacked the answer, but because the truth carried weight, and when she met his eyes again, there was no hesitation left, only certainty. Long enough to know this is not the first time, she said, and in that moment, the silence did not just surround them. It revealed something far more dangerous than whoever waited upstairs. It revealed that the man who believed he controlled everything had been walking through carefully constructed shadows. And the only reason he had not seen them before was because someone else had been watching them for him. The words settled heavier than the silence that surrounded them. Not the first time. And Kang Ji-hyun did not respond immediately because something in that statement demanded more than a reaction. It demanded a recalculation of everything he believed about his own control, his own systems, his own awareness. His gaze shifted past Amara for a brief second, scanning the upper level again, not looking for movement now, but for patterns, for the absence of what should have been there, and that was. When it became undeniable, the security rotation was wrong. The subtle rhythm of presence that he had memorized over years of discipline was broken, replaced with something too still, too deliberate, like a stage waiting for its actor to step into the spotlight. He exhaled slowly, controlled, the kind of breath that did not release tension but redirected it, and when he looked back at her, there was no dismissal in his eyes anymore, only focus sharpened by necessity. Then why now? He asked, quietly, his voice no longer questioning her authority, but the timing of everything unfolding around them, and Amara's fingers finally released his sleeve, not stepping away, but repositioning herself slightly to the side, her attention split between him and the unseen presence above, calculating distances, angles, possibilities with a precision that did not belong to someone who simply cleaned rooms and followed instructions. Because tonight they expected you to come home later, she answered, her tone steady, each word placed carefully as if sound itself could travel where it should not, and Ji-hyun's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, not in suspicion of her, but in recognition of what that meant. His schedule had been known, predicted, used, which meant the breach was not external. It was internal, woven into the structure he had trusted without question. A faint sound followed, softer this time, like a controlled adjustment of footing on polished wood above them. And Amara's gaze shifted instantly, her posture tightening just enough to signal awareness without creating movement that could be detected, and without thinking, without analyzing the decision the way he would have any other. Ji-hyun mirrored her stillness, his body aligning with hers not out of obedience, but instinct responding to something real, something immediate. There's a secondary corridor behind the service kitchen, she continued under her breath, her voice barely forming the words. It connects to the rear staircase, out of direct view from the main hall. And he knew that corridor, of course he did. He had designed half the structural flow of this estate himself. But hearing it from her, hearing the route framed not as architecture but as strategy, shifted something deeper than logic. It shifted perspective. You memorized the house, he said, almost to himself, and Amar's expression did not change. But there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, something that hinted at a truth she had not yet offered. I pay attention, she replied simply. And for a moment, that answer carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have, because attention, real attention, was something even powerful men often lacked when they believed nothing could threaten them. The clock in the distance ticked again, louder now, marking seconds that felt stretched thin, and Jae-hyun understood with absolute clarity that standing still was no longer neutral. It was a choice with consequences, and yet moving blindly would be worse. Exactly what whoever waited upstairs intended. He took a single step backward, deliberate, controlled, placing his trust not in the situation, but in her assessment of it. And that step changed the dynamic completely, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally, because for the first time, the direction he chose was not dictated by his own certainty, but by someone else's awareness. Amara did not react to the significance of it. She only moved when he did, guiding without leading, her presence aligning with his in a way that felt less like assistance and more like synchronization, two separate understandings converging into one silent decision. And as they shifted deeper into the shadowed edge of the room, away from the open space that invited exposure, the house seemed to hold its breath even tighter, as if waiting to see whether the man it had been prepared for would follow the path laid out for him or choose something unexpected. And in that quiet, in that narrow space between movement and stillness, Kang Ji-hyun realized something that unsettled him far more than the unseen threat above. The only reason he was not walking directly into it was because someone he had never truly seen had already learned how to see for him, and had decided, for reasons he did not yet understand, that he was worth protecting. They moved without sound, not because the house demanded silence, but because silence had become their only advantage, and every step Amara took was measured against something unseen, her pace neither hurried nor hesitant, just precise, as if she had already mapped out the consequences of every possible misstep before it could happen. And Kang Ji-hyun followed, not behind her, not ahead of her, but with her, his presence controlled, his breathing steady, adjusting in ways he had never needed to before, because this was no longer a situation where dominance solved the problem. This was a situation where awareness decided survival. The shadowed corridor near the service kitchen opened slowly before them, its narrow walls absorbing the faint light from distant fixtures, turning every surface into muted gray. And as they slipped into it, the air felt different, cooler, contained, insulated from the open expanse of the main hall, where visibility was a liability. And for a moment, the tension shifted, not gone, but redirected into something more focused, more intentional. Jae-hyun's gaze moved to the small details again. The way a tray had been left slightly out of alignment on a counter, the faint scent of something unfamiliar lingering beneath the usual polished cleanliness of the estate. And he understood now that these were not accidents. They were signs, subtle disruptions placed into a system designed for perfection. And the fact that he had not noticed them before did not sit well with him. "You saw all of this earlier," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time. And Amara did not look at him when she answered, her attention fixed ahead, her voice low and even. I noticed what did not belong, and there was no pride in it, no attempt to impress, only a statement of fact that carried an unsettling weight. Because noticing what did not belong meant she had been observing long before tonight. Long before this moment forced her into visibility. They reached the turn that led toward the secondary staircase, the narrow path partially concealed by the architecture of the estate, and Amara paused, not stopping abruptly, but allowing the moment to stretch just enough to listen, really listen, not just for sound, but for absence, for the unnatural stillness that revealed more than movement ever could, and Ji-hyun mirrored her again. His posture still, his mind moving rapidly through possibilities, recalculating not just the threat, but the structure of trust that had been quietly dismantled without his awareness. A faint vibration echoed through the wall, almost imperceptible, like a signal traveling through the building itself, and Amara's expression shifted by the smallest degree. Not fear, not panic, but confirmation, as if something she had anticipated had just aligned with reality. And when she spoke again, her words carried a new layer of urgency, still controlled, still quiet, but undeniable. They are adjusting, she said, and Ji-hyun understood immediately. Whoever was inside had realized something was off, not exactly what, but enough to change their timing, their positioning, their expectations, and that meant the window they had been moving through was closing. He looked at her then, really looked, not as someone beneath him, not as background, but as the only person in that moment who seemed to understand the full shape of what was unfolding. And something unspoken passed between them. Not agreement, not trust in the traditional sense, but alignment, the recognition that whatever happened next would depend on how well they moved together. "What is your plan?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority, refined into something sharper, more focused, and Amara finally met his gaze fully, her eyes steady, clear, carrying no hesitation, only intention. And for a fraction of a second, the world outside that narrow corridor seemed to fall away, leaving only that look, that decision, that moment where roles no longer mattered. "We do not follow what they expect," she said, each word deliberate. "We let them believe you are still in the main hall, and the simplicity of it was what made it powerful. Not confrontation, not force, but misdirection, a shift in perception that changed everything without announcing itself." And as the silence settled again, deeper now, more aware, Kang Ji-hyun realized that for the first time in his life he was not the one shaping the outcome through power, but through restraint, through trust in someone who had lived in the margins long enough to understand what the center could not see. And as they prepared to move again, slower, more deliberate, the house no longer felt like something he owned. It felt like something watching, waiting, and for the first time, he was not certain it was on his side. The plan did not unfold with movement. It unfolded with stillness, the kind that required more discipline than action, and Kang Ji-hyun felt it immediately, the unfamiliar weight of choosing not to advance, not to confront, not to assert control in the way he always had. Because this time control did not belong to the one who moved first, it belonged to the one who understood the rhythm of the unseen. And Amara understood it better than anyone in that house. She reached toward the narrow console built into the wall beside the service corridor, her fingers hovering for the briefest second before pressing a small, almost invisible switch that dimmed a secondary set of lights deeper in the mansion. Not turning them off completely, but altering the pattern just enough to suggest presence elsewhere. A subtle shift that would guide attention away from where they actually stood, and Jae-hyun watched, not interrupting, not questioning, because he recognized the intention behind it. The creation of a false narrative within the space. One that those upstairs would follow without realizing it. "They expect movement," she whispered, her voice calm, her breathing steady. "So we give them something to follow." And the simplicity of it carried a precision that felt almost surgical. No excess, no unnecessary risk, just a controlled redirection of expectation. A faint sound echoed from the main hall then. Not loud, not obvious, but enough to confirm the shift had been noticed, and for a brief moment, the tension tightened, like a thread pulled too close to breaking, and Amara's eyes closed for less than a second. Not in fear, but in calculation, aligning timing with possibility. And when she opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only clarity. "We move now," she said. And this time there was no pause, no waiting for agreement, because the moment itself demanded action, and Jae-hyun stepped with her. Not behind, not leading, but in sync, his movements quieter now. More precise than they had ever needed to be within his own home. As they slipped further down the corridor, toward the rear staircase that curved upward behind concealed walls, hidden from the main line of sight that defined the house's more public spaces. The air grew cooler as they approached it, the faint scent of polished wood mixing with something sharper, something that did not belong to the controlled environment of the estate. And Jae-hyun noticed it immediately, filing it away without comment, because now every detail mattered. Every shift in scent, in sound, in light carried information he could no longer afford to ignore. Halfway up the first turn of the staircase, Amara slowed, her hand lifting slightly as a signal rather than a command, and he stopped without question, his body responding before his mind fully processed the decision. And in that stillness, he heard it again, closer this time, a subtle movement above, not careless, not rushed, but deliberate someone, adjusting their position in response to the false cue they had created, and the realization settled into him with quiet certainty. They had taken the bait. He glanced at Amara then, not seeking confirmation, but acknowledging it. And for the first time since the night began, there was something different in his gaze, not just recognition, but respect forming in the space where indifference had once lived, because what she had done was not instinct alone. It was understanding, layered, practiced, precise. "You anticipated this," he said under his breath. And she did not deny it, did not soften it. She simply answered, "I listened before anyone else did." And those words carried something deeper than the moment itself, something that reached back beyond tonight, beyond this house, into a history of being unseen and therefore able to see everything. And Jae-hyun understood then that this was not a coincidence, not a sudden act of courage. This was who she had always been, someone who survived by noticing what others ignored. The silence returned, but it was different now, no longer oppressive, no longer uncertain. It was controlled, shaped, part of a strategy that was unfolding step by step, and as they continued upward, slower, more deliberate, the house no longer felt like a place of comfort or control. It felt like a carefully constructed illusion that was beginning to crack, revealing something beneath it that had always been there, waiting. And for the first time, Kang Ji-hyun was not the one uncovering it. He was the one being guided through it by someone who had lived in its shadows long enough to understand how to move without ever being seen. The higher they moved, the thinner the margin for error became, the staircase narrowing not just in space, but in time, every step carrying them closer to whoever had entered a house that was never meant to be entered unnoticed. And yet here they were, already inside, already adapting, already shifting their expectations based on movements that were no longer predictable. And Kang Ji-hyun understood with a clarity that cut deeper than any external threat. This was not random. This was designed by someone who knew how he operated, someone who understood his patterns well enough to manipulate them. Amara slowed again near the top of the concealed staircase, her hand brushing lightly against the wall as if feeling for something invisible, not searching, but confirming, her senses tuned to details that most people would never register. And Jae-hyun watched her, not impatient, not questioning, but studying, because every second she took had purpose, and every pause was part of a larger calculation he was only beginning to understand. "There's a blind angle ahead," she murmured, her voice so quiet it barely existed beyond the space between them. "If we move through it too quickly, they will hear it." And he nodded once, not because he needed instruction, but because he acknowledged the logic behind it, the shift from power to precision now complete, his instincts no longer pushing him forward, but aligning with restraint, with timing, with her. The faintest echo of movement reached them again, but this time it was different, less certain, as if whoever waited beyond was no longer entirely confident in what they were tracking. the false signal they had created beginning to distort the expectation that had been so carefully set, and Amara recognized it instantly. Her posture adjusting by the slightest degree, her breathing slowing even further as if syncing with the environment itself. "They are second-guessing," she said, and there was something almost imperceptible in her tone. Not satisfaction, not relief, but confirmation that the shift in control was working, that the narrative had begun to fracture in their favor. Ji-hyun's eyes narrowed slightly, not in tension, but in focus, because second-guessing was where mistakes were born, not just from them, but from the ones waiting, and that was where advantage could be taken without force, without confrontation, without revealing anything more than necessary. They reached the final step before the upper landing, the space opening just enough to allow a view of the corridor beyond, dimly lit, stretching toward the private rooms that few were ever allowed to enter, and Amara stopped again, not hesitating, but anchoring the moment, her gaze scanning the line of sight with quiet intensity, mapping what could not yet be seen. "There," she whispered, not pointing, not moving, only shifting her focus slightly toward a section of the hallway where the shadows fell just a little too evenly, too deliberately, and Ji-hyun followed her line of sight, his vision adjusting, his mind aligning with hers, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pattern revealed itself, the absence of natural variation, the stillness that did not belong to an empty space. He exhaled quietly, the realization settling into him without panic, without urgency, just clarity, because now he understood not just where the threat was, but how it was positioned, how it expected him to respond, and more importantly, how it did not expect him to respond. "We do not go forward," Amara said, her voice steady, her decision already formed. "We let them believe we will." And again, the simplicity of it carried weight, because expectation was the real structure they were navigating, not walls, not corridors, but assumptions built on predictable behavior. And by stepping outside of that, they were rewriting the outcome without ever announcing it. Ji-hyun glanced at her, not questioning, not doubting, but recognizing the pattern that had been forming since the moment she touched his sleeve, every decision rooted in observation, every action designed to shift perception rather than confront it. And for the first time, he understood the full scope of what she had been doing, not just tonight, but long before, watching, learning, preparing without ever needing acknowledgement. A subtle shift in the hallway ahead confirmed it again. The presence reacting, adjusting, waiting for a movement that would not come. And the silence that followed was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to both sides now. A shared tension stretched across unseen lines. And in that fragile balance, Kang Jae-hyun realized something that settled. Deeper than strategy, deeper than control. The reason he was still one step ahead in a situation designed to outmaneuver him was not because of power, not because of fear, but because someone who had never been seen had chosen to see everything, and in doing so had quietly changed the outcome before it ever had a chance to unfold. The silence held, but it was no longer empty. It had weight now, pressure that built in the space between what was seen and what was understood, and Kang Ji-hyun could feel it shifting, not around him, but against him, testing the edges of a plan that refused to reveal itself. And for the first time, he did not try to break it. He let it unfold. Beside him, Amara did not move, her gaze fixed on that unnatural stretch of shadow ahead, her breathing so controlled it almost disappeared into the stillness, and yet everything about her presence spoke of motion waiting to happen, of timing that had not yet arrived. And Ji-hyun understood that this moment, this pause, was not hesitation. It was the most critical part of everything they had done so far. A faint creak echoed from the corridor, subtle but deliberate, like someone shifting their stance after waiting too long for something that never came. And that was when the balance tilted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to signal impatience, enough to suggest that whoever remained hidden was beginning to doubt their own expectation. And Amara caught it instantly, her eyes narrowing by the smallest degree, her posture adjusting not backward, not forward, but inward, refining the space she occupied as if preparing for something precise. Now they are listening for you, she whispered, her voice barely forming sound. Not watching, listening. And the distinction settled into Jae-hyun's mind with sharp clarity. Because watching required confirmation, but listening required anticipation, and anticipation could be manipulated. His gaze flicked once more toward the corridor, measuring distance, mapping angles, not for confrontation, but for disruption. And for the first time since entering the house, a different kind of control began to form, not the kind built on force or dominance, but the kind built on understanding how others expected him to behave and choosing not to meet that expectation. Amara shifted slightly then, her hand brushing against the edge of the wall near the landing. Not randomly, but with intent. And Jae-hyun noticed the smallest detail, the way her fingers paused over a narrow seam in the paneling, almost invisible unless someone knew where to look, and with a subtle motion, she pressed inward, triggering a quiet mechanical response that echoed faintly behind the walls, distant enough to mislead, deliberate enough to draw attention away from where they stood. The effect was immediate, not loud, not obvious, but enough, a soft shift somewhere down the hall, followed by a nearly imperceptible reaction from the shadowed space ahead, the kind of movement that revealed presence without exposing it. And in that moment, the roles reversed completely because now the unseen was reacting, not waiting. Jae-hyun felt it, that shift, that fracture in control, and something inside him adjusted with it, not resisting, not overpowering, but aligning with the strategy unfolding beside him. Because what Amara had created was not an escape. It was a redirection, a silent command placed into the environment itself, telling the hidden presence where to focus, where to move, where to expect him to be. We give them certainty, she said softly, her eyes never leaving the corridor, and then we take it away. And the precision of that thought, the simplicity of its execution, carried a weight that settled deeper than anything else that night, because it revealed not just what she was doing, but how she thought, how she understood systems built on control, and how easily they could be shifted when someone saw beyond the obvious. Another subtle sound followed, slightly further now, a repositioning, a recalculation happening in real time. And Jae-hyun knew, without needing confirmation, that whoever had planned this was beginning to lose the clarity they once had, their structure bending under the pressure of something they had not anticipated, something they had never accounted for. He turned his head just enough to look at Amara again, and for the first time, there was no question in his gaze, no doubt, only recognition, not of her role, but of her presence, her importance in a moment that had already begun to redefine everything he thought he understood about control, about awareness, about who truly saw the world as it was. The silence returned once more, but now it belonged to them, shaped by their choices, guided by their understanding. And as they stood there, unmoving, unseen, Kang Ji-hyun realized that the outcome of this night had already changed, not through confrontation, not through power, but through something far quieter, far more precise, the decision of someone who had spent her life unnoticed to step forward at the exact moment it mattered most, and in doing so, rewrite a story that was never meant to include her. The shift was complete now, invisible yet undeniable, like a current beneath still water, and Kang Ji-hyun could feel it without needing to see it. The structure that had once been carefully laid out for him was unraveling, not collapsing in chaos, but bending, adjusting under pressure it had never been designed to withstand, and at the center of that pressure stood someone no one had accounted for. Amara did not move immediately after the second misdirection. She waited, not for confirmation, but for consequence, her gaze steady, her awareness stretched across the corridor ahead and the silence behind them, listening not just for sound, but for hesitation, for the subtle fracture in timing that revealed uncertainty. And when it came, it was almost imperceptible, a delay, a fraction of a second too long before the next adjustment. But it was enough to confirm that the unseen presence had begun to lose its certainty. They are repositioning again, she whispered, her voice softer now, not because the danger had lessened, but because control had shifted, and control demanded precision, not volume. And Jae-hyun understood it, Not just the words, but the weight behind them, because repositioning meant reaction, and reaction meant they were no longer leading the situation, they were responding to it. His eyes traced the corridor once more, the unnatural stillness now slightly disturbed. Not in a way that exposed anything directly, but in a way that disrupted the pattern he had begun to recognize. And for the first time, he saw what Amara had seen from the beginning. Not a person, not a figure, but a presence defined by what did not align, by what did not belong. If they move further, they lose their advantage, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. And Amara gave the smallest nod, acknowledging the same conclusion. Their understanding now aligned without the need for explanation, two perspectives merging into one clear path forward. She stepped slightly closer to the edge of the landing, not enough to expose herself, but enough to adjust the angle of perception, her hand once again brushing against the wall, not searching this time, but activating, triggering a second subtle shift in the environment, a faint change and lighting deeper down the corridor, barely noticeable, but intentional, guiding attention further away, stretching the distance between expectation and reality just a little more. The response came almost immediately, a slight movement, further than before, the unseen presence. Committing to the misdirection, following the narrative that had been carefully constructed for them. And in that moment, the balance broke completely, not with noise, not with force, but with realization, because now they were not just reacting, they were being led. Jae-hyun felt it settle into him, that quiet understanding that this was the moment everything turned, not because the threat had disappeared, but because it had lost its position, its certainty, its control, and that was more powerful than any direct confrontation could ever be. He glanced at Amara again, and this time there was something deeper in his expression, not just respect, but recognition of something rare, something he had not expected to find within his own walls, a mind that operated beyond hierarchy, beyond assumption, grounded in observation and patience rather than authority. You knew they would follow, he said, his voice steady, and Amara did not deny it, did not soften it. She simply answered, "People trust what feels predictable." And those words carried a quiet truth that extended far beyond the moment, beyond the house, and is something universal, something that made even the most powerful vulnerable when they believed too strongly in their own patterns. The corridor ahead fell still again, but it was no longer the same stillness as before. It was emptier now, less precise. The structure that had once been carefully held in place now loosened, stretched, and in that subtle difference, Kang Ji-hyun understood that whatever had been waiting for him had already lost the version of him it expected, and in doing so, had lost its advantage. The silence deepened, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, shaped by decisions that had already changed the outcome before it ever had a chance to fully unfold. And as they stood there, unmoving, unseen, Jae-hyun realized something that would stay with him long after the night ended. That control was not always about being seen, about being known sometimes. It belonged to the one who could remain invisible long enough to understand everything and choose the exact moment to step forward, and in that moment quietly change everything. The silence did not break. It resolved, settling into something final, something that no longer carried tension but consequence. And Kang Ji-hyun stood there at the edge of the landing, his gaze fixed on the corridor that had once held uncertainty, but now felt empty in a way that spoke louder than any movement ever could, because absence, true absence, was not quiet. It was confirmation. Beside him, Amara did not relax, did not shift her posture in relief. Her awareness still extended outward, still measuring the space as if the night itself could change again at any second. And Ji-hyun noticed that the discipline it took to remain present even after the moment had passed, the refusal to assume safety simply because danger was no longer visible. A faint sound echoed somewhere deeper in the house then, not sharp, not urgent, but controlled, familiar. The subtle rhythm of footsteps that belonged to those who were meant to be there, his security team finally reasserting their presence. Their movements cautious, deliberate, as if they too had realized something had been wrong long before they could fully understand it. Ji-hyun did not call out to them, did not announce himself, because something in him had shifted, something that understood this moment did not belong to authority or command. It belonged to recognition, to understanding what had just occurred without needing to explain it. He turned his head slightly, looking at Amara fully now, not as part of the environment, not as someone who existed in the background of his world, but as the reason the outcome had changed. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because words would have reduced what had just happened into something smaller, something less precise than it truly was. "You saw everything before I did," he said finally, his voice low, not heavy, not dramatic, but grounded in a realization that carried weight beyond the night itself. And Amara did not lower her gaze, did not step back into invisibility the way she might have before. She simply met his eyes with the same steady clarity she had held from the beginning. And when she answered, her voice was soft, but unwavering. "I was already watching," and there was no pride in it, no attempt to elevate herself. Only truth, simple and unfiltered. The hallway behind them remained still, the structure of what had been planned, now completely undone. Not through confrontation, not through force, but through something far quieter, far more precise. And Jae-hyun understood that more clearly than anything else, that the outcome had not been decided in the moment of action. It had been decided long before, in the unnoticed details, in the patterns someone else had taken the time to understand when no one else thought to look. The security team approached from the far end of the corridor then, their presence filling the space that had once been uncertain, their posture alert, their eyes scanning. But even as they arrived, even as control seemed to return to its expected place, Ji-hyun did not move toward them immediately. He remained where he was, standing beside the one person who had changed everything without ever needing recognition. His gaze lingered on Amara for a second longer, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a command, not an acknowledgement in the way power usually expressed itself, but something quieter, something more lasting, a shift in perception that could not be undone. She stepped back then, just slightly, not retreating, but allowing the space to return to its familiar structure. Her presence softening at the edges, as if she were slipping back into the role the world expected of her. But Ji-hyun saw it now. The difference, the truth beneath it, and he knew that invisibility had never meant absence. It had only meant no one had been paying attention. The room settled fully, the tension dissolving into quiet order, but the silence that remained was not the same as before. It carried memory now, understanding, and as Ji-hyun finally turned toward his approaching team, his voice steady, his presence once again controlled. There was something different beneath it, something that would not fade with the night, because for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the room knew exactly what it felt like to be the one who had been protected. And in that realization, something deeper than control had been rewritten, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. And the silence that followed said everything that did not need to be spoken, and the room went still.